we want to talk about the future of sourcing today. And it's especially important to me to talk to you about this. And it's the first time that we're addressing the MENA audience as Archlet, as a company, because I believe that in your region, the future is very much always right in front of your door, right? And you guys are so much more like you're advancing so much faster than a lot of other regions in this world, that I think it's just a very appropriate moment to speak to you about this. What I want to cover off today is basically just a little bit about where we see the future going and why we believe that that is not happening just now, but also give you a little bit of an advice of how can you take the first steps. What enabled me to even talk about these kind of things, right? So I have been very much in your position. I have been in procurement for over 10 years now, and I started out as a global category manager for Bayer and Unilever, before I then skipped over to Deloitte, where I started to consult on procurement-related topics, technology, operating models, processes, savings opportunity, assessments and delivery. So you name it, I was involved in quite a few of those things. And with this background, I'm now also working here at Archlet with the team to deliver a product to procurement professionals that can really help them move forward. And what we're focused on is really this idea of advanced sourcing, analytics, and scenario optimization capabilities that we believe have been missing in the market for quite some time, or at least have been missing in a way that is really available and applicable to most organizations. So that's enough of us. Let's talk about the future of sourcing. And in order to do that, we need to, first of all, do a step back and have a look a bit at the history and the current state of technology in procurement. So procurement technology has basically been around for the last 25 to 30 years. And it very much started out with this focus on enterprise resource planning and the SAPs and Oracles of this world, really getting the backbone in place and making sure that processes are supported by technology. Once that has been established, and in the early 2000s, we have seen the emergence of some of these bigger suite providers that really try to take it to the next level and really provide a broad spectrum of different services to procurement teams. And basically giving it also an interface that was a little bit more attractive and usable than the ERP systems of the past. And then over the last 5 years, we've seen the latest stage of development when it comes to procurement technology. We have seen the emergence of loads and loads of small startups, we call them best of breed providers, that instead of going broad, go very, very narrow and deep. So really with a focus on how can we solve one particular problem that the systems before have not properly addressed or have not been able to fully fix. And so that's where we are right now. I believe we will probably still continue to see the rise of more solution providers. At the same time, we already now start to see that there is some level of consolidation and that new mini suites basically start to emerge. And I think that's something that we will probably now see for the next 5 to 10 years to continue. And one of the things that really always drives me when I look at this picture that was kindly provided by DPW is that there's one problem that still seems to linger in the bag and that has not been addressed. And that is, and especially in sourcing, that a lot of organizations still very much do everything in Excel. Not only to analyze the tenders, but a lot of the procurement processes actually you could apply this to. And that's quite interesting because we have seen how the technology has been there for, as I said, almost 30 years. There has been an explosion of these best of breed providers now, and again, also already for 5 years. And I would say the talk about digitalization in procurement has been around for 10 years at least. And still we're at this very moment in this position where everybody is doing everything in PowerPoint and Excel. And I think that's why, even though it's 2022, it still can sometimes feel like we're stuck in the 90s. Especially if you're a category manager, a sourcing manager, you still probably do not leverage the the capabilities that are out in the market to the point that they would be available and to the point that they could really simplify and facilitate your professional life. And what I see is that sourcing is very much still cumbersome because, as I said, if you work in Excel, if you only copy paste information back and forth, then that's not really the most exciting task on the one hand side, but it's also not very productive and effective because it prevents you from making more holistic decisions where you actually see the full picture at the moment where it matters. And so that's what I would talk about in just a little bit. But the reason why I find that challenging is that it especially doesn't allow you to enhance your decisions and to bring in these additional data points. And now in 2022, I think data is probably one of the words, big data even, is one of those terms that everybody is using all over the place. And we in procurement, we have that data. We have loads of information. And so, not making use of that is a big shame. And so let's talk about where can we go from here? What does an alternative future look like where this challenge is solved, where we don't do that anymore? And we did a little panel discussion earlier in January on this. And so one analyst from Gartner, Koray Köse, he's a senior director over at Gartner. He said that over the next 2 to 5 years, we will actually see that a lot of technology will make sure that processes become machine-driven and human-approved. So that means that, you don't actually have to do the non-value-adding work, but you just try to make the decision and support that. And I think that's very interesting. But in order to understand that fully, I would like to introduce you to a concept that is actually borrowed from the automotive industry, where we're talking about autonomous cars in the same way that we talk about autonomous sourcing in procurement. But what Koray is saying here is more about you are still the one in the driver's seat, right? And when you look at this model, you could basically draw this up for every process in procurement. There's always a difference in maturity, and you can always come up with 5 different ways of pointing this out, right? So we are talking about the future of sourcing, so therefore I'm using that one now. And if you continue with this analogy of the car, then let's say level 1 used to be the horse and riding, whereas we are in procurement talking about doing everything in email, Excel. And level 5 is the self-driving car, or in our case, this autonomous sourcing where, the machines are doing a lot of our job. And as you can see, there's a lot in between with eRFQ and e-auctions that are, smarter, facilitating processes and making sure that some of the human error is already taken out of it. We then talk about sourcing optimization, where we add a layer of intelligence and insight into the process on top of all of that to make sure we move into this idea of guided sourcing, where basically it's assisting tools that give you options and show you, okay, what can I do? But you then still need to make the decision. And this is all great. I love this picture. I love this idea of moving up towards level 5. The reality, though, is that the majority of people are at the very, very beginning of the journey. The talk at the moment is all around autonomous sourcing, full automation, all of those things. That's what we talk about as being the future. But that's like us being in the early 20th century, talking about cars being able to fly, pretty much. We're still very, very far away from some of these things. And I think that's a little bit the shame, but also the opportunity for the future that we actually, as procurement professionals, can shape. Because technology develops at a speed. You and I, we can impact very little around that, but we can make sure that we use the things that are available to us. And so if you ask yourself now, just some very simple questions, like how many events do you today run through an eRFQ process? Are you building, when you do so, the data structures in the system? How many auctions do you run? When you say few or none, then this picture is very, very true for you. And there's no shame in that, but it is just then the reality of things. And those are the tactical tools. Those are the tools that are not smart. They only make sure that they leverage or they simplify processes. Now, if you already said no to that, then probably the question for level 5 that you would have to ask yourselves, how many events that are very repetitive in nature and have clearly specified items do I have? Again, if you say very few, then this idea of bots and self-running machines is something that is probably not really all that relevant for you. But I do believe that there's this middle ground, everything between level 2 and 4, where there's tremendous value and tremendous opportunity that was already there in the past, but now going forward with technology changing, becoming even more relevant and applicable to all of us. And so the last thing that I wanted to talk about here is now the Gartner hype cycle. So Corey explained it to me, and it's basically all about having, a period of time where everybody is talking about something being great and having a lot of opportunity, and it needs to go up this hump and overcome it first. And at the top of the hump there, you either see, okay, now this really takes off, or it disappears. And I think in sourcing, we have a lot of stuff that is still in this very early stages where there's a lot of promise to it, but we're still a little out with seeing that it is actually delivering on its promise. Whereas there's other elements that are a lot higher up the curve and can therefore be something that we can use today and really leverage for our organizations. And I think this is now the next part of the presentation that I want to talk about. What is a realistic future? So again, we talked about the far out there, the 20 years ahead of us. But what is it that is more realistic and that we can do today? So without having our heads in the clouds, really with our feet on the ground and with our hands ready to do something, to be put to work, what can we do? And so in the same panel discussion, we had Dr. Eloise Epstein from Kearney. I don't know if you know her, but she's definitely one of the most interesting voices in procurement and in procurement technology, especially that I have met over the last years. She's a digital futurist, so therefore that's her work, right? She just thinks about these kind of questions all day long. And she basically said, CPOs, you guys are in the driver's seat. You need to embrace digital technologies. You need to basically lead the charge here for your organizations, and you need to make it a priority. And what she then said was that it's not about like all of this fancy technology that's upcoming. It's making use of the one that has been developed 20 years ago to really make sure that your organizations step forward. And so in her quote, she said something about holistic sourcing decisions through advanced scenario optimization is a powerful tool to actually become a more strategic business partner, to really leverage the data that you have. And I think when talking about the future of sourcing, to me, that is a very valid point and a very good starting point. Because I believe that the future belongs to holistic decisions. Again, ask yourself, how many times do you just solely determine the answer or like the award decision of your sourcing events based on price? It happens, but it probably becomes less and less often. And we see that a lot of organizations have a lot of other priorities that we as procurement people always saw, we always thought of, we always incorporated in one way or the other. But as I said earlier, when we only use Excel, when we don't use technology to support us with that, then it's very inconsistent. It's not something that we can really then say, yep, thought about it. Yes, it is embedded in this decision process. And I think that's where now the opportunity is, because everybody is talking about the importance of sustainability, the importance of making sure that you diversify your risk, that you bring more stability into your supply chains. And this is where I believe this idea of holistic decision is really taking shape, that we bring all of these factors in and think about our award options in terms of scenarios. And so when I talk about scenarios, I just wanted to bring in a couple of ideas here, but scenario-based thinking is something that the military has developed in the late 80s and 90s and has been applied ever since. And all it is basically thinking about all of the different options that you have at your disposal and how could it go? How could it go right for us? How could it go wrong? You guys probably play a lot of chess or other similar games where you need to think 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps ahead, and not only for your moves, but also of the opponent. And so this is thinking in scenarios. You play through all of the different ways that something could turn out. And I believe in procurement, that's a very, very powerful tool that not a lot of people utilize today, because the technology that they have been using, Excel, has just not been able to facilitate that process. But everybody has asked, oh, I want to limit my number of suppliers. I want to have a certain qualification level of my suppliers. I want to make sure that my preferred suppliers are actually going to be considered. All of those different things, we talk about them as business constraints, or as business rules, and they can be internal by you and your organization determining them, or they can be external by your supplier just saying, well, I can only do so much. I can only deliver X amount of what you require. All of these external factors, you can build them into scenarios and basically then compare those in order to see clearly what are my options. And so when I talk about the future of sourcing, I believe that thinking this way and using technology to enable that, that is what the future, a very realistic future, is holding for us and where we're going. Not necessarily just talking about everything being automated and run by bots. And so if I leave you with just these 3 quick takeaways, then my recommendation to this audience would be stop chasing pipe dreams. Really start, instead of thinking about what could be possible in 10 years, look at what can you do today and focus on those opportunities where you really can drive a lot of return for your organizations. And those are usually not the ones that are most hyped. The second point is start small, stay agile. It sounds very, we heard this a million times, but it is nevertheless true. The future is unpredictable. I think in January, nobody predicted the situation that we're in today. And that's only 3 months or 4 months in, right? So therefore, I believe it's very important for organizations to make small bets and to monitor very closely if they are achieving what they set out to achieve. To do so, you need to obviously, first of all, determine what you want to achieve and then really measure that. And once you see that it works, double down on it and go all in. And then last but not least, think holistically. So as I said before, there's no shame in not doing it yet. There's no shame in working in Excel and Outlook, because that is what everybody is doing. But there is an opportunity to step up and to really start to lead the pack and become a bit more future-minded and technology enabled. And I believe that holistic decisions is a great way of doing that. And so therefore, try to investigate that technology and see where that can take you. So that was it with my main presentation and what I wanted to share with you. Just if you're interested in the technology behind it and how it actually works, I can highly recommend to you our beginner's guide to sourcing optimization that you can either download here by scanning this QR code, or you can go to archlet.io and find it there. And if you're more interested in topics around sustainability and like how different types of business strategies and priorities can be incorporated into this technology, I can highly recommend our white paper on making sustainability actionable to you. With that, these are different ways of how you can get in contact with me. Please feel free to sign up to our newsletter. We share thought leadership content like this one all of the time. And so we really would appreciate you joining us on that. But also feel free to join either Archlet or myself or both on LinkedIn so that we can stay connected and talk a little bit more about how we can shape the future of strategic sourcing. So with that, that was the presentation part. I think we're now 25 minutes in, and I just wanted to put up these 3 different aspects of where I see the future of sourcing will have an impact and will change the way we work today. So it's either on the technology side, it will impact our people, and it will require our operating model to change in profound ways. And so please feel free to use this as inspiration for now our discussion and the Q&A session. So with that, Sam, I would say back over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Fabian. Stay where you are. Great discussion. Lots of food for thought. Yeah, the future of sourcing. Interesting. And I think before we go into the questions that are flowing in at the moment, an interesting part here that I just wanted to focus on is we're talking a lot about the future of sourcing and the technological solutions and things that are hype and aspirational. I just wanted to focus on first, actually, Fabian, before we go into other things. What is there now? What actual solutions are people using now? Which modules? What's trending out there, and who's using it?
Yeah. So I broadened it out of sourcing a little bit for just a moment, right? So historically, what we've seen is that people always start their digitalization journey with P2P or sourcing. P2P just for the simple reason that there's a lot of inefficiencies usually. There's a lot of different touch points that machines can very easily handle. And so that's why that was a very easy starting point for everybody. The second one was sourcing, just because with sourcing, you can basically drive better results in your negotiations. And you can basically unlock the funds to invest into your digitalization agenda. And so I think that's why those two have historically always been a very good starting point for organizations that didn't do anything before and are still to this very day, I would say, extremely powerful. And since then, I think people have now matured more, and things like spend analysis became a very, very simple next step where people really try to get a better understanding of, okay, what am I even facing? Where do I spend my money? To then, again, focus their priorities, focus their initiatives. And again, from there, determine, okay, where do I want to source, right? And so in between, I've seen now over the last 5 years, develop a couple of tools that are focused on either the aspect of category management, where they are now say, okay, let's take a strategic approach to that, or to just facilitate this collection of those ideas and measuring the impact, this kind of pipeline management. And so I think that's probably the order where you start at the back or in the middle. And if you start in the middle, you fund the back or the top. And so at the end of the day, you focus on all five. But those are the things that I've seen people really do. And in sourcing in specific, I mentioned it earlier, unfortunately, even though technology has been around for some time, I would say that standard capabilities like e-sourcing, like e-auctions are still not used, still getting a lot of questioning because people don't apply them, because people find them a little bit clunky. So back to my point from earlier, it feels like the 90s a bit. But I think the new breed of solution providers is now addressing exactly that point, making it a little bit more attractive and user-friendly to use, but also to then, again, investigate these ideas of automating the tail spend, automating simple negotiations, and moving more towards like this level 5. So those are things that I would say in technology have really been over the last 5, 6, 7 years, the key themes that emerged.
And in terms of, so those are tools and the themes. What about software selection? What are people looking for? They're going one-stop shop. What's the theme? What's the direction of traffic?
Yeah, one-stop shop is one of those terms where everybody is looking for the one-stop shop and the Amazon-like user experience. I think that's the, when I was a consultant, those are the two terms that you probably hear the most, where everybody's like, oh yeah, I want one for all. And that's still where a lot of people go. That's still where a lot of people think, let's start with that. Everybody else is doing it, can't be that wrong. And they're right. I mean, like, there's a lot of good stuff. And if you want to keep it simple to start out with, then that is definitely still a very viable way to go. The reason why that emerged was that was the only aspect that was there. And so there was basically do nothing or go in that direction. Whereas today, I would say the technology landscape looks very different. Now we have these very tailored solution providers that can be very good on one particular thing. And then you pick another one that's very good on another one. And so people need to start talking more about how does data flow? How are different things connected? And then they will very quickly see, well, some of these connections are not that great anyway. And so therefore, the one-stop shop might be a nice building. It's like going to the mall. But within a mall, you usually go to one where there's 15 different stores, right? And 20 or 50 or whatever. I know in Dubai you have a pretty big one. So I think that's more the mindset where people are going, but it is still going to take a couple of years, I would say, before people really start embracing that, because people basically say, well, I can't go wrong by choosing SAP, right? And you can't, like, but if you will always find exactly what you're looking for, that's on a different piece of paper.
Interesting. And I think, yeah, you're probably right about the idea of shopping for brands, but I mean, you did mention the region when we first started. Would you find there's any regional prevalence in adoption of software for sourcing purposes? Is there any differences between the regions, between Middle East, Europe, etc.?
There probably is. There most definitely is. Do I have a perfect view on that? Probably not. But I would say that in Europe and in North America, what we've seen is that basically everybody above a certain level of spend has some sort of technology in place, right? So there's very few, let's say, above 1 billion in spend that have nothing at all. And so for those organizations, if you started your journey 4 or 5 years ago, it's very difficult to then say, well, let's do something else again, right? We just realized that there's something better now. And I think that's more the reason why people are just going what they have. Whereas in the Middle East, where I think historically there hasn't been such a strong focus on, oh, we need to have something at all, because a lot of the development has happened also over the last 5 years. I think there's just a very unique opportunity to not run into that same kind of process, right? Now in SAP and some of these other larger suite providers, they're probably very large in your region because, I mean, they're large everywhere, right? But I think because you might not have this established situation, you can look at these 5 levels and maybe not immediately jump to level 5, but you can easily jump to level 3. And so you can basically skip a step now and take 2 steps at the same time. And I think that's really the beauty and opportunity that I really see in your region. Yeah.
And I mean, if you do adopt that approach, does compatibility come into it when you start having a suite of bespoke solutions for a single process?
Yeah, I mean, as always, you need to look at what drives the largest value for your organization. You cannot just go in like, oh, perfect, now I just buy 15 of those. I don't think anybody could handle that. I would probably, after 2 weeks, say like, yeah, I resign, I'm out of here, because there's just too much going on with that. But compatibility comes back to the point that I raised earlier, right? What are the actual connectors between certain things? I would say a spend analysis tool, I mean, does that really need to be integrated with your sourcing capability? Probably not. Like there's very few use cases that actually support anybody on the ground doing the job by having an integration between them. There's ways, but there's also other ways where I'm like, okay. And I personally believe that the same can be true for contracting, right? Sourcing and contracting, even though people say it's very, very close. Yes. But from a data perspective, from what do I put in one versus the other, fairly limited. And so once you accept that, and once you start to open your mind to not, oh, one-stop shop and everything comes from one and it flows seamlessly from here all the way to here. Once you move beyond that point, I believe compatibility becomes something else. Compatibility becomes more like, what are system providers that actually have the same ideals, that share the same perspective on how to approach things and how to solve something for their customers, to then more have this connection of these three parties to actually talk about, okay, what do we need? Like, what drives the biggest value for you, your team, your stakeholders, your organization? And that's where I believe it's a very interesting conversation for people to have.
Thank you. And that addresses a couple of questions specifically raised by Sarit Ventura during the session. But let's just go back a second, because you've got compatibility not being the end of the world, as you're saying. So maybe not an approach, a one-stop shop approach either. So, I mean, if that's the case, picking up some of the other questions here, what's, other than the fear of change, what actually keeps an organization moving, as has been mentioned here, beyond Excel? In other words, why hasn't sourcing optimization been adopted more widely at the stage we're at the moment?
I think for the same reason that some other technologies haven't been properly accepted and implemented, like, as I said, standard sourcing. I mean, like, as I said before, standard sourcing, even if you have a solution in place today, you might not really use it the way it was intended. You might use a suite as like a glorified email outbox, because you just attach files to it, but you don't build data structures into it, right? So like that kind of idea is true to so many things. But what are the underlying reasons for that? Because, I mean, it's not that people don't want to do it, right? I mean, my assumption is people want to do that. They want to use things that make their life easier. I always wanted to do that, after all, because I just didn't like spending time on things where I'm like, oh, why am I doing this? And I think that is the reason for that, is that the interfaces, they were just not intuitive. The solutions were not that attractive. And if you open up a solution where somebody says, you need to use this, and you're thinking like, oh, why? Then, like, the willingness to invest your time and to really engage with it is limited. And so I think that is now the beauty of what we've seen over the last couple of years, that things become more attractive, more user-friendly, more flexible. And flexibility, I think, is another very, very big one, where, again, especially now focused on sourcing, if you have very, very structured or very complex events, where you have a lot of indirect spend, or you have things where you have lots of price breakdowns and all of that stuff. If your solution doesn't allow you to easily set that same structure up in your system, you're out of it. Because then you basically say, I'm so much faster just doing it offline that I will attach the Excel, but I will not bother to build the structure. But if you don't build the structure in it, you cannot learn. Then you cannot actually leverage the data. You cannot analyze it. And again, so I think by bringing in this flexibility, this is really this is the kicker. This is what changes everything, making it easy and accessible and user-friendly. And to come back to your point on sourcing optimization now specifically, why has that not been adopted? Because it is so complicated. The tools that have been around for 20 years, I mean, unless you're a real math crack that really wants to deal with technology, it just has been too complicated to use for the majority of people, and especially for everyday use. And that's why people said, yes, I use this when there's a real value, when I have my 500 million tender. But for my 250,000 or even 2 million project, not worth my time. So I think that's really the reason why it hasn't been adopted. And where, again, we are, among others, are trying to change that and make it more accessible and easy to use, so that people can easily say, all right, I just uploaded an Excel. So, there's nothing wrong with Excel, don't get me wrong. But I just uploaded it, and then I can leverage the technology and the power that I want. And I don't need to be a postgraduate degree in order to use it.
Excellent. There's a fair amount of passion there when you talk about these things, and that's obviously tangible there.
I love procurement technology.
So what I mean, what's out there then? In that regard, what are you excited about? And on the flip side, what would you say is hype?
Yeah, I mean, I know this may come across as not genuine, but I truly mean it when I say I'm excited about holistic decisions and like bringing all of the different points together. So that's something that hasn't excited me more than anything else over the last 3-4 years. Because as I said, when I was in sourcing, I used my auction tools, I used my RFX tools, and that was all great and fun and fine. But once I was introduced to these more complex tools, and again, I'm a little bit of a nerd for procurement technology and for sourcing technology. So therefore, for me, it was like, oh, wow, shiny new toy, let's do something with it. And so that excited me already then. But once I then saw how you can simplify that to really make that accessible, that's what really excited me the most. Yeah, so I'm very passionate about that. But on the other side, what's the hype, right? I mean, I've been in consulting, and in consulting, you talk a lot about automation, right? Automation is a big thing for a lot of organizations, and it's very important. And I believe there's a valuable reason for that. But I think it's a little bit like the term AI. It has like, in your head, it becomes something bigger and bigger and bigger. And all of a sudden, everybody's like, oh, whoa, what is that? And so when you then show it to somebody, right, how simple it can be, because certain things that the machines can do, we could do as well. It would just take us forever and we wouldn't do it for that. So when you show it to them, they're like, oh, that's it. Oh, I thought of like some fancy machine that was doing everything for me, right? And so I think the hype is more about the terminology, because people don't look beyond it. They don't scratch the surface. They just want to hear AI, and they don't actually want to think about what's the use case, what's the problem that I'm trying to solve. And I think especially in automation, that has been a bit of a concern of mine, because I feel like we're wasting time on talking about something here where I feel like, there's so much cooler stuff out there than that. And don't get me wrong, it's all great. It's like there's use cases. It's just like, think about it as like, is it a 1% use case where I solve 1% of the problems, or is it a more like 90% use case? And so I get more excited about that stuff, not about the 1%.
In other words, have you complicated something more than it needed to be complicated, just because you're chasing digital technology? But anyway, I get the point there. And let me go to a question from Usama, who's asking, in your opinion, Fabian, what are the top 3 restraints in successful implementation of e-procurement and digitalization within SCM functions? And it'll be even better if you can give a slant on what you think about this, especially in the Middle East region.
Okay, so the top 3 concerns, or
top 3 constraints in successful implementation of e-procurement or digitalization solutions.
Yeah. Well, okay, so the number 1 is people are not brought along. So that's like, if I forget everything else and don't make it too free, I think that's usually the number 1. Because at the end of the day, if somebody decides without bringing in the people that will have to deal with it, that's a setup for failure right there. And I think that's bringing me back to my point earlier on this attractiveness and this user centricity that solutions need to provide, and not just in words, but really by people feeling that when engaging with technology. Because if they are part of the selection process, if they have basically seen it, touched it, smelled it, then, like if they say, yes, let's do this, you have a much stronger power to say, we all are in this together. We all decided for this. Let's do it and let's make it happen. So I think that's for me the number 1. The second one is, again, think about what does that do to people? Because there's a lot of fear that comes with these kind of changes, right? And again, automation is one of those trigger words where there's immediately fear, oh, my job will disappear, right? And so I think managing change in a very good way is probably one of the other most important criteria, so that people really understand, what does it to me? How does it help me? What does it take away? What does it add? And to really have that communication around it. Because if people are struck by fear, from, oh, now there's this tool, then they will, like go a little bit like a deer in a headlight and just be like, I don't want to do anything anymore. I don't know, everything is wrong maybe. So avoid that by, again, addressing that change and clearly managing that. And I think the third one would then be, when you think about org structures, like where does it sit? Is it really something that needs to be done by everybody? Or is it more the selected few that need to deal with it? And accordingly provide support. Because support can be something that can be, again, very big, but it can be very small, but still helpful, right? And I think this support structure to provide that is extremely important, again, from a people perspective. So it's always coming back to people, because we're doing this with people and to people. And so we need to give them the tools and the support to be successful with us. So I think those are the three that I would use. And I personally don't think that there's any difference in the MENA region. I think people are pretty universal when it comes to that, to those aspects.
Okay, so there's no maturity gap in procurement digitalization across the world, like there maybe is in procurement per se. Interesting, and that's good to hear. Obviously, organizations who have not yet started their digitalization journey, and presumably there are some. There's different levels of adoption, I'm sure. But for organizations who haven't started, where do they start?
Yeah, I touched upon that a little bit earlier when I talked about what have we seen over the last years, right? And again, I think it's really down to how does your business work? How complicated is it? Because there's some businesses that are fairly straightforward and they will profit from looking more into the risk management space, whereas there's others that are highly complex and highly connected that might find value in, yet again, other topics. So, but as I said, if you have a lot of transactional processes and a lot of transactional spend, then again, P2P can be a very powerful starting point, just again, to automate these processes, to also, like introduce a lot more rigor to some of those processes. Whereas if you are more focused on procurement, then sourcing is better. Because think about it, like there are some technologies that procurement owns. Sourcing is owned by procurement. Spend analysis, owned by procurement. Category management, it's only addressing procurement. I mean, like there's obviously always other people that need to be involved in all of that, but procurement is the main user. Whereas when it comes to contract management, all of a sudden there's legal. If it comes to P2P, there's finance. And so therefore, again, think a little bit about like, where can you drive fast results? And obviously starting where you're in control is usually a bit easier, unless the rest of your organization is already pushing because there is a problem with contracts not being maintained, or there is from finance a lot of pressure that, again, there's no structure in running POs and things like that. So I think about it more as like, okay, where does your organization has the biggest struggles and how fast can I act on that? And based on that, I would make then the call on where to start. But there's no right or wrong. So it's really down to your pains.
Excellent. So yeah, it is a problem-solving area, isn't it? I mean, you're really not going to go into digitalization just because you want to. There needs to be a problem that it's solving. Otherwise, you're just going to replicate what you have in the manual world. But I mean, it's interesting you mentioned about the different stakeholders, because obviously there are different stakeholders. You don't just have a digital solution in the procurement sphere that runs across the whole organization. Yeah, you mentioned, very correctly, legal will obviously have a big impact, if not a complete impact in the contract side of it, and obviously P2P with finance. So how do you use digitalization to inform business holistic decisions, strategic decisions or strategic imperatives that cover the whole organization? Is there an answer?
There's multiple. Let me try to offer one. Again, I think people need to start somewhere, right? I mean, it's not realistic to just solve it all in one go. And so therefore it always comes back to understanding what has the highest priority, what has the highest value, or where do we experience the highest pain. And when I talk about these holistic and connected decisions, at the end of the day, you need data in order to inform your decisions, right? And the good thing is, with most tools, like what I pointed out earlier, like the scenario-based optimization, if you have it in Excel today, you don't even need to have another solution per se. You can use the data sources that you already have and incorporate it. Is it the fanciest way of doing things? Probably not, but does it work? For sure. Is it cheap? For sure. So, you know, like, again, think about it from that perspective. But if you don't have the data at all, and that doesn't help you, right? Like, I mean, like, then you need to get that first from somewhere. And so therefore, I would say you need to look at your organization and see what are the different data points that we have, what are the strategic priorities that we want to pursue, and then start to close the gaps. And again, scenario-based thinking that's just a vehicle for you to then apply it. But if you don't throw in any information, any data, then again, it can only work with what you give it. And so that's how I would look at it. Try to assess the problem, find where the data is coming from, and then steer from there.
Awesome. I think, Fabian, let me just go on to the last kind of holistic or strategic question, which is where we started. What really is the future of sourcing? What's the direction of traffic? Where is the thinking going? Are we getting automated into one-stop shop? Are we getting best of breed modules? Are we replacing humans with bots? What's the future of sourcing?
I believe that it's all of the above. Just not completely and end-to-end. Will there be bots? Yes, there are already bots today, and there's use cases where bots is the perfect way to deal with certain things. There's no going back from there. There's just more like, has everybody heard about it yet? And there's this time lag between, everybody hearing about it and everybody adopting, but that will happen. Is that the one answer for everything? I absolutely do not believe so, because again, and I asked you a couple of questions. If you don't have this repetition, if you don't have this clear specification, well, I think the technology in itself is not smart. It's just written by people to be smart on certain things. And so that's why I don't believe that that's the only future. And that's why I think what Corey said in this quote that I pulled out earlier, that it will be like a lot of things will be machine driven, but the human now needs to make the decision on it. I think that's really where we're going. And that means we will not replace people. Like, priorities may shift, like your task may be adjusted because certain things now can be done by tools that weren't possible beforehand. But I really believe this idea of guided sourcing, where we give you the options and you then need to decide what is the best way in my current situation. The tool doesn't know that, it doesn't understand your entire environment. But that's where I believe the future is going, that you have more data, more pieces of information that you need to handle, because a lot of more tools are throwing this stuff at you at a much higher pace. And you then need to be like, I do this, and for this, and this reason, and not being like, because if you do that, then you might be replaced at one point, right? But really having the skill set to understand what is the data telling you? What are the trade-offs? What are my opportunity costs? And then to make an informed decision. That's the role of a procurement manager. And the tools are just taking out all of the non-value adding tasks that usually keep you from thinking about that a little bit more in depth.
The answer is to adopt technology, embrace it, but don't compete against it, because for the tasks that you assign to technology, technology is more efficient at completing them than you, perhaps.
Very often, yes.
Well, I don't mean particularly, Fabian.
That's not a reason to be afraid of it, right? I mean, like, as I said before, I loved auctions. I ran loads and loads of auctions because I was like, why not? Like, it's so much more efficient. It takes me 30 minutes, or I can spend 3 days or 5 days on it. like rather spend those 5 days somewhere else.
Fantastic, Fabian. It's been really interesting hearing your thoughts on the future of sourcing and the adoption of different types of technology as well. Thanks for taking the time. Thanks for a really informative session. We've had a number of questions come through, and for everyone in the audience, if any further questions come, please feel free to pass them to us and we can share them with Fabian. The recording will be available to all of you who've attended, and also as will the information that Fabian shared during the session. So thanks for attending. Thanks for taking the time to the audience. And finally, once again, thanks so much to Fabian for joining us today. All the best.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Fabian.